The IMF has declared a global recession as the world economy remains paralysed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has sparked a sharp and sudden decline in demand and output and millions of job losses. It's really hard to predict how long the lockdowns will last or the time it will take to recover, with some analysts like McKinsey saying that it could take up to 3 years for the US alone. But to discuss what's needed to help us prepare for the unknown, we have joining us today Dr. Larry Samuelson, Professor of Economics at Yale University. We're also joined by Dr. Graham Ong-Webb, a fellow at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University. Well, let's start with you, Dr. Larry. Analysts are predicting a near zero growth rate for the global economy this year. Projections for China alone have been slashed to the 2% range. And, well, what do these downgraded projections tell us about the possible pace of recovery?
Well, we know the first quarter of this year was not too far off of ordinary. The second quarter is going to be a disaster. In the United States, we had last week more than 3 million new unemployment claims. That's many times more than the worst experience we've had in the past. We have entire economies that have told everyone to stay home. In light of this, if we get out of this year with a 0% global growth rate, that, in my view, will be good news. The only way we can get 0% is that by the end of the year, indeed a good amount before the end of the year, we are done with closed economies. We're done with people having to stay at home. We are opening up our economies again. And so that will mean that we will have gotten a handle on the virus relatively quickly. A 0% growth rate for this year, that's going to be good news. And then the question is going to be, how long will it take to bring us back to sort of ordinary growth rates?
So even a 0% growth rate would be good news for us at this point, where we really don't know how far global growth is going to fall. Wow.
That's right. If we go for many months at our current state of economic activity, we're not going to have a zero rate of growth this year. We're going to have something a good bit lower than that.
I see. Well, Dr. Ong-Webb, the airline industry is one of the sectors being directly hit by this pandemic. And the International Air Transport Association actually said that airlines might burn through $61 billion of their cash reserves during the second quarter of this year and post a quarterly net loss of $39 billion. And that's a 71% drop in demand. The crisis has also worsened existing challenges and vulnerabilities in the aerospace and automobile industries as well. Do you think these sectors are going to be able to survive this crisis, even with the massive bailouts? And, well, really, how important are these industries to restoring our economies?
Those are very good questions, Soo-Young. Clearly, the global community highly depends on transportation in this day and age to get things done, moving from place to place, whether for the movement of commodities, produce, services, people. And I think right now we're seeing this come to a near halt. I think the answer is quite prescriptive, but the answer has to be yes, these industries have to be propped up and need to be supported to survive, because we highly depend on these transportation networks, particularly the aviation domain. But right now, as we can see, many of these commercial airlines are literally dropping like flies. They're folding because of the severe liquidity challenges that many of them are facing. So from a competitive standpoint, one could argue that we're seeing the weeding out of weaker players. But nevertheless, I think everybody is, in net terms, are highly impacted by this, because we do depend on on cheap air travel in order to get things going. I think we're going to see a dramatic transformation of the aviation industry in the medium to long term, notwithstanding the pain we're facing right now. In the future, I think we're going to see a very different kind of commercial airline industry. So technologists, for example, are saying this is a great opportunity for us to rethink how we move from place to place, especially in light of the new normal when it comes to social distancing measures. I mean, mind you, COVID-19 presumably isn't going to be the last health security challenge or pandemic, if you will, that we're going to face down the road. And so we need to make preparations for future risks like COVID-19. And I think technologies will have to come into play to support that. For example, air taxis, where people can travel from place to place, but not in a clustered fashion, which clearly increases the risks of exposure.
So what you're saying is just putting these industries on life support won't really be enough, but they're going to have to look beyond that and actually be creative about it so that they can actually last, existing challenges that they were already facing. Well, Dr. Larry, we've been trying to put them on life support, many governments across the world, and so far the biggest stimulus plans that we've seen amount to around 10% of GDP. But some say that we're going to face a situation that's actually worse than the Great Depression, when global GDP fell by 15% between 1929 and 1932. So do you think that the current level of spending is really enough?
The current levels of spending and proposed spending are clearly a good start. I expect that we're going to see more. There are already plans in many places for second rounds or perhaps multiple rounds. And this increased spending is going to be critical for how the recovery goes. As Dr. Ong-Webb said, we have many industries, many firms facing liquidity crises, facing challenges to their very survival. When we're released from our lockdown, when our economies come back into motion, there's going to be tremendous pent-up demand. All sorts of purchases have been delayed. They're going to come to bear. The question is whether the productive technology, whether the firms, the industries, the supply is going to be there to meet it. If we do nothing, there's a good chance that they will not. And if that's the case, then the recovery is going to be very, very difficult. If we start to lose firms, lose whole industries, if workers drift away from their jobs and they're hard to get back, it's going to be very difficult to recover quickly. If we can get a big enough stimulus plan going that we can keep our productive capacity intact until we're free to make use of it again, then we can hope for a relatively quicker recovery.
So we need to keep things going for long as we can and keep the status quo as much as possible. Well, Dr. Ong-Webb, these policies, they're going to, inevitably leave parts of the corporate sector with even larger debt burdens. Do you think this could lead to a protracted recession and additional layoffs that will last a long time beyond the virus?
Well, I think Larry might be in a better position to answer this question, but here in Singapore, we align with the importance of the question you've raised about corporate debt. As you know, already as it stands, we are sitting within the fourth wave of global debt. Debt levels historically have never been higher than we see them today. According to some estimates, about $253 trillion of debt worldwide, both public and private debt put together. And so now I think we only are going to kick the proverbial can down the road in terms of solving the debt crisis or crises that we're facing around the world. All I can say in the short term is that there is a need to roll out temporary relief to businesses, institutions to keep things running. And so I think this discussion about solving the growing debt crisis is something that has to be somewhat deferred. My only concern, looking at the region here in Southeast Asia, is about the challenge of correcting some of the suboptimal behaviors that we saw in the past by governments, financial institutions, and also borrowers, households, that really led to a series of our own regional debt crises plugged into a larger, global situation. But I think right now people are feeling the pain. We need to keep industries propped up, and so the stimulus packages are a welcome relief.
So what you're saying right now, what we need is a shot in the arm. We need to keep these businesses going. But what about you, Dr. Larry? Do you think that, do you think we should be thinking of provisions for future debt restructuring at this point?
For future, certainly. There's no question we're going to come out of this with governments having taken on extraordinary levels of new debt. Under some circumstances, this might not be too much of a concern, but as Dr. Ong-Webb just mentioned, we're already sitting at historically high debt levels. Excessive debt has threatened to tear apart the European Union. One of the great mysteries facing current macroeconomics is that we have all of this debt and yet no very strong hints of inflation yet. Usually the common response to extraordinary debt is inflation. We have to keep the stimulus going. If we don't do that and we let our economies collapse, it'll be even more difficult to get out of the debt hole that we have already created for ourselves. Our best hope is to take on additional debt to keep the economies working, to get the recovery going. But then we're going to have levels of debt that would have frightened us just a little while ago that will now seem normal, and we're going to have to find some creative ways to deal with that. Debt restructuring is going to have to come onto the discussion.
And on that note, it might require some multilateral efforts. And really, Dr. Larry, we keep hearing about the need for global coordination in policy, and some are even floating the idea of a global Marshall Plan. What would you say this entails?
It will entail, as you said, considerable global coordination, which unfortunately is not always easy to come by. Something like a global Marshall Plan would be a wonderful response to that and would even be a slight silver lining from this whole episode if we could come out of it with that. What we would need is sharing of information between countries as to what their debt levels, what their balance sheets really look like, and some understanding of how we could get mutual gains out of multilateral debt actions.
I see. And what about you, Dr. Ong-Webb, just before we go?
Well, I share Larry's views on this, and yours, of course, about this proposition of a global Marshall Plan, sorely needed. But I also take the concern that we're not in a very good place right now in terms of the coordination efforts across the global community. Already prior to COVID-19, we were seeing a pivot away from much needed coordination with this onslaught of deglobalization, if you like, with the rise of nativism and tribalism, if you like, or protectionism, not aided, by the actions of certain governments around the world that haven't encouraged greater coordination and interaction between them. So I think this is going to be challenging, but I think push comes to shove, we will definitely have to come up with creative solutions, as Larry mentioned, in restructuring global debt, because it's something that we clearly can't run away from.
Right. So as global and as widespread this pandemic is, we're going to need, tighter, much stronger connections and cooperation between governments themselves, cross-border efforts. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, though, for joining us, Dr. Larry Samuelson, Professor of Economics at Yale University, and Dr. Graham Ong-Webb, a Fellow at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University.
Pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
This is also where we close the show today, but we will be back at the same time tomorrow with more global insights from experts around the world. Till then, have a lovely evening or morning wherever you are. Goodbye.